Thank you, Shirley, for your extremely kind words of welcome. Professor Chen, distinguished guests, excellencies, dear colleagues of the Advisory Council, dear members of the board, dear students, dear participants. It is, in fact, today obvious that we are living exceptional times. The world is going through great transformations. There are some discussions. Is it just a transition? Is it a rupture? But even if it's a transition, we don't know where to. So in fact, it becomes a rupture. The world, it's clear today, is becoming more volatile, polarized, fragmented, more complex and complicated, more unpredictable, and also more dangerous. And this is the result of some trends that we have seen since the financial crisis, the great financial sovereign debt crisis, but also the COVID-19 pandemic and the geopolitical challenges, including the situations of war we have in the world. These trends have been, in fact, deepening, they have been enlarging, they have been amplifying, and they have been externally accelerated. Sometimes they are mutually reinforcing forces, and we see them. Some of them are structural, like the demographic imbalances, including fertility imbalances that generate some demographic movements, including in terms of migration. Issues of sustainability, the climate and environment sustainability, and energy security crisis. Global power competition that is increasing and will only increase. Also, the scientific and technological revolution, and I underline the word revolution because indeed we are in the middle, or probably better, at the beginning of a real technological revolution, including in many areas that are for dual use, AI and other very important developments in this field. And if this was not sufficient, we have also recently, in terms of our democracy, seen what I call the change of the grammar of politics. I mean by that the change of the principles and rules that make democratic politics. We have changed the way of communication, going not through the mainstream media, but bypassing the mainstream media, sometimes going against it. And also all the conventions of diplomatic behavior are now being put in question by this change of the grammar of politics, not only in terms of communication, but also in terms of diplomacy. This shows that the conflictuality we have today in the world is not just among nations, but within nations that are becoming also more polarized. So all this adds to this complexity and unpredictability of an already very difficult situation. This also is creating some levels of anxiety. So there is a psychological dimension on those matters. They may be structural, they may be economic, they may be environmental, but in fact they also have a psychological dimension that generates anxiety, including the fueling of resentment. For me, resentment is one of the defining feelings of our age. An age today we have with some paradoxical evolution, because we have at the same time, because of all the photos, all the glamour of TikTok and others we have today. We never had generations that got more photos than today. We have a mixture of seduction and glamour and fear. And that is fueling this sentiment, including the sentiment of resentment that we see that some people try to mobilize against what we used to call the West, open societies and open economies. And all this was partly also triggered by the pandemic. The pandemic, as Shirley said, I was chairman of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and I watched it very closely. How this was taken by the governments of the world as a lesson to invest more in security, including economic security, because they saw how the supply chains were broken, and in fact, progressively replacing in economic terms a concept of efficiency by a concept of resilience. Today, governments all over the world, not only governments, companies, they are investing more in this resilience than probably in the old concept of efficiency, although, of course, they try to combine both. Resilience is, in fact, a very interesting concept that comes originally from physics, the stress of materials, materials that come back to the status quo ante after some stress, but goes to psychology, including the trauma, when people go through some trauma and they have to recover their previous situation. And that is exactly that concept of resilience that was at the origin, as Shirley mentioned just now, of the initiative taken by some of us, including myself, to create that commission, Reform for Resilience, that was at the origin of CAPRI. And CAPRI was embracing since the beginning a concept of holistic understanding. So not just about public health, but linking public health with the environment, with financial and economic sustainability, and also other very important issues of this concept. So how can we address these issues today, those challenges that I've mentioned? There is what I call the 3 Ps, that's well known: promote, prepare, and partner. Promote your capabilities. For instance, in Taiwan, your leading position in the microprocessors, it's a great capability you have that is, there are no other in the world like you. All entities should promote their capabilities, but should also prepare, and I say prepare, not predict, because there is an illusion of prediction. In fact, instead of trying to predict the future, we cannot really predict the future. The future is open by nature. We can prepare for the different futures, plurality of futures, that we can. Who could have predicted, for instance, giving you some examples from Europe, who could have predicted Finland and NATO, Finland and Sweden in NATO? Just some days before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, nobody predicted. Who could have predicted that Germany will change the constitution to allow for investments in defense without respect of the public debt? No one has predicted. But because of the actions of someone, a gentleman called Putin in Russia, it was his decision, everything changed. And so it shows that behind the trends, the structural trends, the actions of individual leaders, the decisions or lack of decisions of politicians can have an impact. And leadership, good or bad leadership, in fact, matters. And we should be attentive to that. So instead of predicting, we should at least prepare, but we should also partner, to have partners, to diversify our connections. And this is important today because, as we know today, it's a common sense to say that old globalization is over. I personally don't believe that we are in a process of deglobalization. I believe that we are in a process of re-globalization, where probably the new name of globalization is regionalization. And so it makes sense, instead of trying to have universal agreements like the ones we had before, in the time of old multilateralism, for instance, WTO agreement, in Marrakesh Treaty, that in fact I was, as foreign minister of my country, one of the signatories in 1995. There will be not these kind of treaties in the future, in the foreseeable future. Like we don't have, for instance, today any chance to have any other agreement universally accepted on climate change. So Kyoto, or the climate agreement in Paris, or Marrakesh will not come. This old multilateralism is, for the time being, dead, because the United Nations are blocked. WTO, WHO, the climate agreement of Paris, they are blocked. And that reminds us that we have to find other ways that will probably not be the multilateralism, but what some people call the plurilateralism way, where regions are able to focus more. In Europe, we have this. I hope, and this is also happening today here in Asia-Pacific region, but I also hope that we can build cross-region initiatives, like, by the way, what we have achieved recently in terms of trade. So the reality is that in spite of all those forces I've mentioned, for protectionism, or for nativism, or for isolationism, we are seeing very interesting developments. Trade is being very resilient. In fact, trade is growing in spite of all negative forces against trade and all forces of protectionism. In fact, we are seeing that science and technology continue to expand. There is one good thing about science and technologies, is that governments cannot control it because they are more linked to the intelligence of people. So in fact, there are forces that will continue to be determinant, even if they are not, sometimes they are under threat. This is why I really believe that for some global public goods, like public health, like climate protection, We need institutions that are able, in a new creative way, to find ways of convergence. Like Gavi has done it. Gavi is now commemorated its 25 years. It's in fact an international organization, but it's a foundation. It's a public-private partnership where we have the governments, but we also have there the pharmaceutical companies and research institutes, and also NGOs, and also other contributors to this common goal. So that's what CAPRI also is. CAPRI is also a very interesting institution. We have a precious institution here in this region, trying to build in an original way a convergence of people from the public and private sector, independent, this is important, but also having this Asia-Pacific impact and this Asia-Pacific nature. So, and also trying to mobilize public and private forces. So I really believe that the future for global cooperation is to some extent through public-private partnerships with variable geometry, focusing on very important issues for the common public good. And of course, above all, this is education, education, and education, and science and innovation. And knowledge. Knowledge is not about information, as a professor of mine in the US said many years ago. Knowledge is sometimes the process by which you delete useless information. We have to be able to try to understand the world in this amount of incredible information that we receive every day, and also with a quality that I like to underline that it's not very often mentioned, and sometimes is underestimated, is the quality of imagination. Another form of intelligence. And sometimes here, humans are still very important at the head of artificial intelligence, because algorithms are better in the rational prediction, or what they try to do as prediction, than imagination and creativity. So we need that imagination to imagine the futures, and futures that are good for mankind. I know mankind is a very complex concept, and I will end with this remark. Today is not very popular, at least in Europe, to quote Russian authors or Russian literature, but I love Russian literature. And a great writer from Russia, Dostoevsky, in one of his books called Karamazov Brothers, he says, "My father loved mankind in general, but he hated every person in particular." So this is not the kind of mankind I refer, not a statistic, abstract concept of mankind, no. Mankind, every man, every woman, every child. This is more important than any state, any party, any ideology, or any other concept. Every person, the dignity of every human being. And I believe that if we focus on that, we can achieve great things for that mankind, but not an abstract quality of mankind, but a concrete concept of mankind made of men, women, and children. Thank you for your kind attention.